Yes. This is actually happening. I am starting the One Piece manga. For those who are new here, my only introduction to the One Piece world so far was the live-action adaptation. I didn't expect it at all, but I absolutely adored everything about that show and that world. So, naturally, now I am more than curious about the source material. It's extremely rare for the adaptation to be better than the source material, and based on everything I know, One Piece isn't one of those rare cases. If I already loved the Netflix show so much, I can only imagine how much more I will enjoy the manga. The reason why I'm choosing the manga over the anime is simple. At the end of the day, anime is also just an adaptation, so I wanted to go straight to the original material. There's just one caveat. I'll only be reading the first 100 chapters, give or take. In other words, the content that the first season of the live-action adapted. I want to give you my reasoning for that, but if you are not interested and just want to get straight to the review of the first chapter of the manga, you can skip ahead a bit. The main reason why I'm not going to read everything is because, since the live-action was my first introduction to the world, I want to stick with that. I want the first time I experience each arc be through the live action. I believe it gives me a completely fresh perspective, and my judgment of the future seasons of the show will be much more accurate if I don't have any prior knowledge of the source material or any specific expectations. Once season 2 comes out, I'll read another batch of chapters that gets covered in that second season, and I'll keep repeating that for as long as the show airs. The strongest argument why I should read the entire manga and get fully caught up is the threat of spoilers. From what I know, the manga is in its final stages, so once the big reveals of the finale happen, it will be very difficult to avoid spoilers. However, from personal experience, I know that being caught up on the manga doesn't automatically save you from getting spoiled. I remember when I was reading My Hero Academia manga, I was fully caught up, I was reading it weekly, but the leaks for each new chapter would be circulating around the internet a day or two before the official release. Sometimes they were scans with fan translations, sometimes it was just low-quality photos with original Japanese, and sometimes I simply couldn't read the new chapter the minute it came out. Even if I tried being careful and scrolling past it, sometimes even a quick glimpse into the panel is enough to spoil something. So I got spoiled many times despite being caught up, and I believe there's the same risk with One Piece. So I am accepting the risk of some spoilers in exchange for the ability to experience each new season of the live action through fresh eyes. So with all of that said, let's get into my review of the first chapter of the One Piece manga, as well as the comparisons to the live action. Chapter 1. Romance Dawn. The first thing I must talk about is the art style. I am not sure about what the general consensus on Oda's art is, but my first impression is very positive. People often have this misconception that realistic art is the best art, and I couldn't disagree more. I firmly believe that realistic art is relatively easy. What's truly impressive is the ability to convey complicated concepts and deep emotions through simple basic shapes, and from what I am seeing so far, that's exactly what Oda does. The art style is quite minimalistic and heavily stylized, and I think Oda uses basic shapes to show what he wants to show very effectively. I also love how exaggerated everything is, especially facial expressions. The live action already felt pretty magical, but the art style of the manga alone adds so much more to that feeling. That's just the nature of the medium. It doesn't matter how much you try, but live action will always have some limits of what you can show, while there are no limits to what you can draw. Also, one small detail I couldn't help but notice is that while characters' designs, shapes, and proportions are all over the place, one thing they all have in common are very large feet, but I think it only adds additional charm and uniqueness to the art style. While I'm still on the topic of the general art, I love how all the narrator boxes have little swirls in the corners. I know it's a very minor detail, but it adds a lot of structure and clarity to the reading experience. Plus, it almost gives an impression as if you are reading from a scroll. Having a very present narrator voice fits the story perfectly. It enhances that feeling that this story is literally a recount of a grand, legendary adventure. Now, let's talk about the actual contents of the first chapter. This was mostly the full backstory between Luffy and Shanks, while in the live action those scenes were interspersed with the current events. I think that due to the nature of the medium, having multiple shorter flashbacks worked better for the live action, but in the manga it's better to have the whole story in one place. Luffy's introduction is extremely effective because it starts with the scene where he injures himself before we get a specific reason why. Those few panels immediately give you a very accurate representation of what kind of character he is. Next, we get to see a lot more of Shanks' crew, and there's a big focus on his first mate. Even after the live action alone, I fully believe that at some point we were going to get an entire flashback arc about this crew, but getting these additional scenes from the manga makes me even more excited for that. It's hard not to notice that Shanks seems so much more playful, teasing, and even goofy than how he was portrayed in the live action. There, he gave off an impression of someone wise and serious with a little bit of well-placed playfulness, but in the manga, he's ridiculous without losing his badassery. I have a suspicion that it won't be just Shanks that went through a change like this. If I had to guess, I think that every character and every event will seem much more goofy and wacky compared to the live action, and if that's true, it makes me really happy. It seems like it's a part of the beauty of this world. I just want to mention that a little bit more serious tone doesn't make the live action worse, but these are just natural differences of the different mediums and their limitations. Next, we meet Makina, the proprietor of the tavern, and here we get introduced to the concept of treasure tap. I think it's cool that this concept is introduced much earlier than in the live action, when Luffy was still a small kid. It's nice to see that while he learned from his experiences that take place later in this chapter, some things always stay the same. The belief this kid has in himself is extraordinary. I might be overanalyzing things a bit, but I wonder if the fact that Shanks mentioned his crew would be going north next will somehow come back later on in the story. I guess I'll just keep my eye out if north as a direction comes up again. Then the bandits appear, and I'll admit I was a bit shocked that the bandit smashed that bottle not on the table, like he did in the live action, but over Shanks' head. It might be just a manga thing, where the normal physical limits of people are way beyond what's realistic, but if it's not, then Shanks is just built different, and that was already clear even from the live action alone. The following conflict between Luffy and Shanks also plays out in a much more funny way than the live action. Like I mentioned before, I suspect it might be a pattern. First of all, Luffy's line about going to find a real role model was hilarious. Then, as his arm began to stretch, the background of that panel was hysterical, with everyone spitting out the booze in perfectly vertical fountains. Then Luffy's reactions and how his face was drawn continued that whole pattern. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that so far, I'm really enjoying the whole ridiculous vibe of the manga, and so far the humor really hits. Next, we get to meet the mayor, a character who wasn't present in the live action at all. All I have to say about him is that he seemed like a really nice guy, even standing up to defend Luffy, even if there wasn't much he could do against the bandits. And speaking of bandits, here they make a comeback, and in the manga, the beating that Luffy takes is much more brutal. It's kind of pathetic to see a whole group of adults kicking and punching a small child. I love that the first thing Shanks does when he arrives on the scene is teasing Luffy. Like I said, it's because of moments like these that he feels really different from his live-action counterpart. But soon after that, the tone switches and Shanks, as well as his whole crew, suddenly seem to have such a cool and menacing aura. Unlike the live action, a full fight doesn't break out. Instead, it's the first mate alone who wipes the floor with everyone, only adding more excitement for any future content when it comes to this crew. Finally, we get to the biggest mystery that had bothered me ever since watching the live action, and that is, how the hell did Shanks get on that boat? I was really hoping that the manga would shed some light, but instead, I'm even more confused. Here, the boat got destroyed altogether, and Shanks and Luffy were left floating in the middle of the sea. Did Shanks really swim to Luffy? I understand that people have different limits in manga and anime compared to real life, but still, swimming after a boat seems a bit wild. Another mystery that goes for both the manga and live action is how did Shanks scare that sea monster away? Was it a specific power that doesn't come from eating a devil fruit, or is it something as simple as Shanks having an aura of a total badass that the sea monster was able to sense? Obviously, do not answer any of that. I'm just theorizing for the future. One of the last notes I have is that I didn't expect a rematch with that local sea monster, but I think it was a nice quick way to show how much Luffy grew and that he is now able to take care of himself. The final note I wrote down as I was reading this chapter was that there was one line that stood out to me, especially because it was repeated twice. Luffy said he'll be a pirate that never falls overboard. For some reason, it seems significant. Perhaps the whole thing will be that he does fall overboard, but he has his crew to save him. Perhaps it will be something else, or perhaps I'm overanalyzing stuff again. Initially, I planned to talk about the first few chapters, but this review is already getting pretty long, so I think that's where I'll end this video. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed hearing my thoughts. If you did, stay tuned for the future reviews about One Piece as well as other stories, and let me know if you have any thoughts in the comments.